and welcome back to the final episode of the third season of the Kitabi Karwan podcast. And we have a super interesting guest for you today because it's very rare when I get to say that a fellow podcast host and a much more popular one than me is actually written a book and has graciously consented to be on our podcast today. We are being joined by Anupam Gupta, the author of The Wisest Owl Be Your Own Financial Planner, which is an excellent book to deep dive into and begin your journey of planning your personal finance and how to go about the entire journey. This book serves as a great companion to one of the book's authors we had interviewed earlier, that is Deepak Shenoy's Money Wise, but it's very different from the first ones because it deep dives into interviews with financial planners and gives you an insight as to why India's journey economically and in the world of finance is different and is bright for the future. Uh, some of you, or in fact, most of you would know Anupam Gupta as a chartered accountant, author, but most importantly, a podcast host. He's hosts the brilliant and the most popular podcast Paisa Vaisa, which has almost 2 million downloads and has won the Best Business Podcast Award at the Asia Podcast Awards held in 2019. Without hyping this up anymore, let's jump right into the interview. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Kitabi Karwan podcast. I have with us someone who needs no introduction whatsoever, Mr. Anupam Gupta, whose book, The Wisest Owl, is one of the really most interesting books that I've read in recent times about personal finance. Uh, just to spice it up a bit, Anupam, I'm going to give you 30 seconds, maybe a minute to introduce the book and just give an idea as to why you wrote the book and what it's about.
Thanks for having me, Siddharth. Very nice of you. The book is about financial planning. That's it, in two words, and it's for everyone, really. From the 25-year-old all the way to someone who's 45. Not so much for people who are retiring, but it's in that big gap. India's population today, half of them are born after 1995. So, and in the last 2 years, you would have seen that there's this massive interest um in personal finance. Most of it, of course, goes into the direction of the stock markets. But this book is exactly for that, to tell you that investments is just one part of the whole process. But given the way India is going, and hopefully it'll be very good, you need to be ready to have a plan with your money. That's what the book is about.
Right. No, and that's a great idea, to be honest, Anupam, because the fact that you mentioned that half of the population is born after 1995. I'm a 1995 kid, so I get exactly where you're coming from, and I think this is one of those things. I think you mentioned it in the book also, but I think a lot of people my age also agree that one of the things that we really don't learn in schools or colleges is financial planning, and the other being taxation, which also broadly does fall under financial planning. People are, and you'd be surprised, I'm a lawyer by training, and my peers, I know people who've finished with their MBAs who struggle with financial planning and uh, taxation. So it's a very noble idea that you've picked up with this book. But where did this idea germinate from? I mean, I know you've been talking about personal finance for a really long time, and that's something you really have a passion for. But what germinated the idea in your
My podcast, just two words, that's simple. Again,
head?
I've been doing this for 5 years now, been very
Right.
lucky to get a few listeners on the way, and the same questions over and over again, Siddharth. What stocks or mutual funds, fixed deposits or debt mutual funds, rent or buy. When you go into your friends, family, social circle, same conversations over and over again. And see, I'm not a financial planner. I'm not a qualified advisor. I'm literally nobody to give my own advice
Right.
about money. So I thought, let me talk to people. Let me talk to the best out there. Let me talk to the veterans out there. Let me talk to them and get them to
Right.
answer their questions. And in the process, maybe people learn about what advice is about. Because today anyone can give advice. Today, YouTube has the combined listeners, the combined viewership, I think, of the top personal finance channels is almost a crore. Of course, some of it will be duplicates, no doubt, because you'll be
Right.
subscribed to all four of my channel. But that just shows you the desire of people to go out there on the internet and search for answers. Because,
Right.
like you said, we've not been taught about this in school or college, and I don't think that's a big problem. यार अभी क्या क्या सिखाएंगे स्कूल कॉलेज में सर? मतलब आपको तो एग्जाम पास करना है, साइंस
So yeah.
सिखाएंगे, केमिस्ट्री सिखाएंगे, ये भी पैसा का भी सिखा देंगे, तो हाउ इज इट गोइंग टू वर्क? So
Right.
I don't think that it's such a big problem that we weren't taught about it in school. Maybe the
Right.
curriculum will change. Times have changed.
Right.
So I think that anytime, any day is a good day to start learning about money. And that's
Right.
the reason why I wrote this book. 5 years of podcasts, same questions over and over again. hopefully this book will help people.
Right. So, Anupam, and this is going to be a very strange question on a book theme podcast, but I find myself asking this way more often than I should. But buy a book, right? I mean, we live in a very digital age. You're a podcaster yourself. You've mentioned that in your book as well. You know, there are blogs and there are other mediums, right? Uh, these are far more interactive mediums to the extent when it comes to passing on knowledge, like maybe a course online or a YouTube video or a podcast, or where you can have comment boxes and there's live engagement. So, why, I mean, and that's something I ask non-fiction authors all the time, right? Why a book? I mean, I personally love reading a book, right? But I mean, what convinced you that this is the best way to kind of disseminate that information that you wanted to pass on?
Yeah, I wouldn't say is a. I mean, whether it's the best way or not is something that would be open to debate. We live in an
Right.
era where attention spans are very short.
Absolutely.
So why a book? A book is forever, and I think that reading a book is now become a superpower. So anybody who commits time to read a book means he's serious about learning.
Mm.
Okay, and I'm not saying that people who go on YouTube or listen to my podcast are not serious about learning. Of course, they are also serious about learning. But a book is forever. You just pick it up, you read it. That's it. It's there in your shelf. It's there somewhere. You can always pick it up. Whereas a YouTube clip, my own podcast, for example, it probably requires you to be. It requires a little bit more effort. A book is something that can easily be picked up. That is the format. The reason, I think, the main reason is a book allows me all the room in the world to really express myself, right? To
Right.
write. A
Mm.
podcast is I have a time limit out there. A YouTube clip, I have a time limit out there. I've been on social media, I've been on Twitter now, I think for some 14, 15 years. That has a limit.
Mm.
At I know that I can do an entire Twitter thread, but people will read that thread, hopefully they'll learn something and they'll forget about it. So I feel that there is stuff for which social media and the short format is outstanding. It's really good. And there's stuff for which I believe books are much better, right?
Right.
So this book kind of explains to you how India's journey in finance has happened. This book has 6 interviews with 6
Mm.
financial advisors. If I were to put this out in a format that is not a book,
Mhm.
I don't think people would consume it with that interest. I would put an interview on YouTube. I've seen people's interest just drops after 5 minutes, or
Right.
even that. How long is a YouTube clip, Siddharth? So today, एक जमाना
Right.
था, people used to think कि 10 minutes is a good length. Today,
Right.
people will see a 10-minute clip at 2x speed,
Right.
and even in 5 minutes, they're just waiting. Yeah, okay. So I've written the book because it has a longer span of attention, a longer shelf life, and it just a little bit. It gives me more room to express myself.
Yeah. No, and I think personally for me, you hit the nail on the head when you said that even a 10-minute videos these days is watched on 2x. For me, I think the best part about a book is that it is a slow burn, as people call it, right? It's something that involves you completely. It involves focus and dedication to reading it. And I think that, as you mentioned, like, it indicates the seriousness of the person who's reading it to kind of towards the topic
Yeah,
that
and
they're engaging with.
I can I can see by the collection of your books behind it, you've got an eclectic taste. I can see Dan Brown from here. Dan Brown
That's
is awesome, and thank you for having my book also out there.
yes.
You know what an honor for me to just sit right next to Dan Brown, and the power of books. I don't need to say
Absolutely.
this to you.
Absolutely. No, but I always make it a point to ask authors about this, that because I always want to hear as to why they chose that particular medium, right? But something that's been going on through, on my head, I mentioned I had Deepak on my podcast a few episodes ago, and it's something that I thought of while talking to him as well. That where do you think is this major lack of communication between the masses and people trying to get the information out there, right? You're one of those people who's trying to put out information about financial planning. There are a bunch of other people who are also attempting to do so via different mediums, right? But yet there is this huge gap, right? Wherein there are people who are still stranded, still hunting for answers. The same questions over and over, as you mentioned, the same questions over and over again, despite there being very clear, let's not say consensus, but broadly people agree on which end to head for, right? I mean, while even going through your book, I was reading the interviews by the 6 RIAs, and there was this question about buying or renting, which almost all of them answered unanimously with the same thing, that unless it's a core value, it makes financial sense to rent, but there are other things associated with it. So the answer largely to that question is fixed, but still you find people going back to that same question, searching for the same answer. So what's this gap? Where do you think this gap lies?
The gap is, how does this relate to me? How does this the I have a question,
Mm-hmm.
and all the answers out there just send me into new directions, and I don't know how this relates to me. Um, it's a very logical process in learning things. Right now,
Mm-hmm.
you look at, take diet for example. um, there was a very conventional wisdom that, you know, um, you have breakfast like a king, you have lunch like whatever, a
Mm-hmm.
normal guy, and you have dinner like a poor person. That used to
Right.
be a very, it used to be wisdom that you reduce your calories on the way. Example number
Right.
one. Then there used to be, breakfast is the most important meal of the day,
Yes.
and now we are at intermittent fasting. People don't have breakfast only. Okay,
Yeah.
so knowledge keeps on changing every time you go along. This is the curve that where people are, that they've learned what is rent, what is buy, what is rental yield, what is interest rate. Okay, so far
Right.
so good. Now when the actual decision comes to them, what advice do I take? And that's why the perspective of all these people was, was just, it was unanimous, but it's also something that you can relate to. They're saying rent when you can and buy when you must.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, someone who's very early in his career can't afford that large down payment, can't afford to commit himself to a longer term payout of EMIs. Rent away. You're getting a great asset. You're getting an asset for which people pay 7-8% interest. You're getting at a 2% yield. So
Right.
rent makes a lot of sense. I personally have friends who could probably afford to buy I don't know how many houses,
Mm-hmm.
and they still stay on rent. Okay. Now all of this is anecdotal. It doesn't relate to you. Your situation
Yeah.
might be different. Yeah. You might be like,
Absolutely.
okay, I know that I'm going to be here in the city for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I want my kid to go to a school. And for me, I don't want the pain of a landlord. So rent versus buy is a very emotional decision.
Right.
Putting that mathematic on a, it's great to see on an Excel file. But when it relates to you, and your commitments, your responsibilities, your priorities, that's where the gap is. People need
Right.
to know how this relates to me. Money is a very, very emotional thing. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's why Morgan Housel's blockbuster book is called The Psychology of
College.
Money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And sold like some 2 million copies there. And I remember something
Yes.
that Morgan had written, he had tweeted when he said that more books need to be many chapters of fewer pages. So that's how books are important these days. That when you're
Right.
writing a book, like, and my book is, even I was surprised. I thought that when I bought Mehnat Ki Thi and I wrote, look at the book, it's less. My own content is, I think, some less than 150 pages. Saurabh's forward, thankfully, pulled it up. But that's how, I mean, that's to answer your question about book and about
Yeah.
spans of attention. But the
Yeah.
gap, Siddharth, is that people need to know how advice relates to me and my money.
Right. No, and that's a beautiful way to put it. That rent versus buy is a very emotional decision, and it just strikes this uh, anecdote that I read. The late Mr. Rakesh Jhunjhunwala, he was, I mean, one of the biggest investors India's ever seen. He had this anecdotal story about how he, in 2004 or 5, he sold some shares of Crisil under pressure of his mother to buy a house. And he spoke about the appreciation in real estate versus the appreciation in Crisil. And, just if you take a step back and look at it, one of the most shrewd and in a very good way, one of the most shrewd investors out there, one of the most clever investors out there, but he had to bow under the emotional pressure of his mother. So that is eventually financial planning does involve all of these emotional quotient
It
and
does.
decisions, which in fact actually brings me to a very interesting bit that I realized right while reading your and Deepak's book, that it actually goes really against what I just said in the previous question, wherein there seems to be this unanimous opinion on things, but financial planning is such a subjective question that there is no two people are the same when it comes to their, I don't know, even financial status, emotional status, or things like that. There are tons of factors that go in, and that makes it such a nuanced activity planning out how do you want to go about different things. I think some of the RIs also mentioned that they really don't prefer engaging with HNIs or businessmen because they have a very different outlook as to go about how to manage their finances. Yeah.
Suresh said that, yeah.
Yeah. So, one of the other things that I wanted to actually ask you is your format of the book is very interesting. It's 6 interviews intercut with some chapters with opinions from your end, right, where you're describing different things that are happening in India, including a chapter on the fintech revolution that's going about. So, was this a very planned format that you took about, or was this just something that evolved into it? Like, did you start off with, say, 6 interviews and then you felt the need to put in these interludes, or was this a very planned thing that you want to talk about these specific things?
No, it's a very lazy decision from me because the previous book that I had co-authored, which
Yeah.
is basically Saurabh Mukherjee's The Victory Project,
Mhm.
that's where I got the format from. It's as simple as that. In
Okay.
the Victory Project, we had, I think, 6 or 7 chapters on 6 principles, since 6 or 7 points on the Victory Project. And each chapter had an interview with a person who personified that aspect. So when we spoke about simplicity, we had an interview with Ramdev Agrawal of Motilal Oswal. When we did spirituality, we had Jason Was. So it's as simple as that. I saw how that format worked really well. It gives a nice break, that when you're reading, it just gives a nice break to the reader also. Also, it gives the reader a choice, that if you don't want to read about how India is changing, just go straight to the interviews, you know.
Hmm.
Or if you don't want to know about financial planning,
Yeah.
let's say that you're someone who's not from India and you don't want to listen to perspectives of Indian advisor, and you just want to understand the revolution, and I call it a revolution because that's what it is,
Hmm.
of how India is moving, then you just read the first part, because that shows how an entire generation has changed. I mean, I'm 50 years old and I'm a Gen Xer, which is, people who are born in the 70s
Hmm.
and 80s also, I think. And I have seen the parental pressure of buying a house, and I'm also seeing the almost irrelevance of
Hmm.
checks,
Hmm.
the
Yes. Yes.
stuff in
Yes.
the banks and all.
Yes.
So that's a massive journey that India is seeing. I have seen where sending money from one to I've sent money orders. I don't know if your listeners know what money orders are. And I send payments now by UPI,
Yeah.
which I think takes less than 5 seconds. This
Yes.
is not this is very unique. I don't think any country in the entire world of more than 1 billion people, not even China for that matter, has seen this kind of a revolution happen in such a short period of time. All of this has happened in the last 6 years. And that's what I've
Mm.
written in the book. So
Right.
that's why I chose the format, because people need to read about this and understand where we've come from. Only then will you know in which direction we are headed.
Right. No, that's absolutely right. I mean, when you were speaking, I was just thinking about this last night. I'm going to Thailand with a few of my friends. So for one of my friends, I'm booked, paid for his visa and I paid for his ticket. And this morning he Google paid me the money, like through UPI. And I mean, it's such a smooth process, like 15, 20,000 bucks just move about with such ease. It's absolutely phenomenal at the rate which India is moving, and how you're getting so many more. For me, the most interesting bit is which is not the speed of how things are happening, but how you're getting more people into the formal economy. Like now you have
Yeah.
rickshaw walas and sabzi walas, and the smaller stores participating in the formal economy, opening up newer avenues for loans and stuff like that. I think, I was speaking to this sabzi wala a few days back about if he suffered any hardships during COVID, and he was mentioning that because he had gotten, I think it was Paytm or I don't know, one of these QR services, and because he had this thing going, he could easily tap into a loan during the COVID times,
Yeah.
right? Which worked out really well for him, which was something really surprising. I wouldn't have ever imagined, say, 10 years ago, him walking into, say, HDFC Bank and getting a loan, personal loan for his well-being. So that's a
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
interesting revolution to go about. But Anupam, I'm going to take a step back from the book and ask
Sure.
you more about Anupam the person. So, Anupam, are you a voracious reader? Is reading something that you really engage in, or is just this writing is just something that?
uh, I remember I had this very long discussion with Saurabh at his house. Through so many cups of coffee and cookies. He had a theory, and when I was discussing this with Saurabh, we both kind of spoke about this a lot. People who read a lot, eventually writing comes easy to them.
Hmm.
Okay, because reading gets the ideas, and writing helps you clarify them. So typically, and I've seen this in the best of authors, are very, very well read people. I remember, we had, for the Victory Project, me and Saurabh had gone to a lot of people's offices and houses, and I've seen places like Manish Sabharwal of Teamlease had. I think we were sitting in his room, and out of four walls, this was his library. I think three walls were floor to ceiling books. That's it. And he's among the most articulate people that you can find. You read any interview of Manish Agarwal, you will come back learning at least two or three things. Okay. We went to Sanjeev Bikhchandani's basement office, same thing again. So I have seen that, reading, writing typically go together. At least for people who are passionate about both. Reading is great, of course. Reading, anybody who reads is great, and I'm not too fussy about the format now. If
Mhm.
people want to read Twitter threads, all the best
Mhm.
to them. No issues at all. As long as you're learning something new every day,
Right.
instead of watching cat videos. I mean, nothing personally against cat videos. My 14-year-old is obsessed with memes and cat videos.
Yeah.
Uh, but yes, I do love reading,
Mhm.
and I love reading across formats. So yeah,
Right.
the answer to the question
Right.
is yes. I really like reading.
Yeah. No, and it's great to see this, spirited defense of reading, because you're absolutely right. I think with this shrinking attention span and this mass availability of wider options of how to kind of utilize your time, and I don't mean this in a negative way necessarily, right? As you said, there are ways of consuming information which might be better than, you might be a visual person. A documentary on, say, World War II might be a better way for you to learn about it rather than
Yeah,
reading.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
But one thing that does actually stand out is the lesser attention span. That is something that is noticeably so. To the extent that I can sense it in my own reading. Like the ability for me to like continuously read has somewhat taken a hit in the last few years, right? And I don't know if it's because of various reasons, but it is happening to a bunch of readers also, wherein there are other things that are taking up your time or are distracting you. That is why you can't
So
uh,
here's a tip.
get back there.
Here's a tip. Just start writing, and you will see your reading coming back.
That's actually.
Writing enforces a discipline on you. Like, and there is one thing that I love doing in my books, and again, this is something that I learned from Saurabh. Um, Writing also helps, and especially this type of writing, it makes you search for sources and material to quote from, and that
Right.
again lands up improving your reading habits. So, I think that would be one tip for me from to you and to your listeners who feel that they're having a tough time retaining stuff. They're having a
Mhm.
tough time focusing. They're having a tough time finishing books. My tip, I wouldn't say advice, would be to start writing, whatever format. You could just write on LinkedIn. Just
Right.
take it as a challenge on you that you'll write 100 words a week. You know,
Right.
and then start make that 100 into 200, make it into 500. Start a blog and stuff like that. Writing is that missing part. I think that's
Right.
something that I want to leave with you and your listeners.
Right. I think I'm going to take that tip to heart, because I think I've always harbored this dream of being an author someday. So no better day to start than today, I guess.
Please write.
Right.
Yeah.
So Anupam, you mentioned you love reading, which is great to know. So could you tell us a bit more about what your reading style is? I mean, to the extent that is there a particular genre you like to read, or and just the second part of that question, if you could tell us a couple of books or a few books maybe from your, not, I'm not asking for your favorite books, but maybe
Uh,
if you could mention books that have impacted you, right? I mean, maybe they changed
oh,
the way you're thinking about things, or maybe they made you look at the world in a different way, or like, they
yeah, yeah.
really impacted your professional career in some way or the other.
I wouldn't say so much about the professional career, but when I look at books that literally, I mean, okay, change my
Mm.
life, it takes me back to my college days and Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Mhm.
Robert M. Persick. I can't remember my thought process prior to reading that book.
Oh,
Everything
wow.
changed after that. Everything changed after that. So that's one. Recently, I think there is a book by Ethan Cross called Chatter, which is about how
Yes.
your mind, there is internal conversation going on and on and on about in in your mind. I think these are the two books that I can specifically mention to you. And I think that the one area in which I'm doing a lot of reading recently is Indian corporate history. So
Mhm.
biographies of Azim Premji, biography of Rahul Bajaj, all of that. I'm just just I'm my Kindle is just buy, because this is it's a new genre, and I strongly feel that India's corporate history is woefully underwritten,
Mhm.
and we are finally making some start somewhere of writing about how India has progressed on an entrepreneurship, from looking at it from an entrepreneur's point of view. Whether it is the Birlas, the Tatas, even the Ambanis, which for obvious reasons it's not been written that much. But you look at everything else. I mean, you know, Gurcharan Das has an entire series on Indian business.
Mhm.
Okay, he just released a book now. I mean, he writes a foreword or he edits these books. He just released a book on the Sindhis.
Okay.
A few years ago, he released a book on the Marwadis. These are written by other people,
Right.
you know, and he writes the foreword. But those are absolutely fascinating. And I'm saying this, Siddharth, because you know how it is these days, right? I mean, a lot of people focus on startup founders. Shark Tank dekh liya to log ekdam
Ah.
excited ho jate and all that. And I'm all for that. That's fine. I mean, if that rocks your boat, then great. But you need to look at India's history.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of things that a lot of Indian entrepreneurs have done
Mhm.
that I think are worth reading about. They're worth reading about. So that's
Absolutely.
then in the art of motorcycle maintenance. That was in college. Recently, Chatter. And the one area in which I'm reading a lot of books is Indian business history.
Yeah, no, and that's a very interesting thing that you mentioned because I remember. So I work in the stock markets. I run my own private fund, so it's something that deeply interests me as well. And I was trying to figure out if I can read something about the Ambanis, right? Like I wanted to read the history of the rise of Ambanis, and I realized there's just this one book which was obviously mired in a lot of controversy. But apart from that, I couldn't really find any reading material to kind of trace
That's
apart from like these random blogs here and there which were not
yeah,
very
yeah.
well quoted on sources or anything, can't
You know,
really.
the best way to read about the Ambanis is very simple. Just go to the website. Every annual report since the day they listed,
Yes.
1977, is out there. That's how I
Yes.
learn. That's just how I learn. It's just those annual reports are more than enough. All
Yeah.
the drama and all that's happened is enough for the papers and all that. I mean, there might be a few books here and there,
Right.
but the real way to understand that family is just read the annual reports. They're public information. They're absolutely free of cost. It requires a little bit of patience,
Right.
but it's very rewarding.
Yeah. I that's another thing that I'm going to take away from this interview. But you're absolutely right. I think it's a very woefully unexplored area of writing. I think there's a lot of scope to figure it out. But and this is exactly why I asked this question to again all authors, right? Because I truly believe that it gives you a very interesting insight into how that particular author's minds work. So like, so for example, just for my listeners, right, when there is someone who's reading up on India's corporate history, who's someone who's interested with how the psychology of the mind works, kind of puts them in a slightly better position than others to write about, say, so when it comes to something as psychological as financial planning, or just even be a very good interviewer for financial planners. So it always adds that nice edge to explore as the personality of that person. So Anupam, tell me about your writing process. Are you one of those writers who just has a spurt of inspiration? I mean, not for the interviews, I'm sure. I mean, that
Yeah.
has to be planned, but for the sake for the chapters in the middle, is it just something that you just get up and write? You need to write in the middle of the night, so you write it down, or is it planned that you take out a certain time and fix and write that?
It's basically a mix of both. I have slots in the day in which I write,
Right.
and that like it would be from 9 a.m. to maybe 1 p.m. Then there's a break, and then there's afternoon, and that's it. That's the end of the day.
Right.
Obviously, all of this goes for a toss when I'm lacking a deadline, and I remember for the wisest owl also, I think I had missed one or two deadlines here and there. So
Right.
that's when everything goes for a toss. So Saturday भी गया, Sunday भी गया, family time गया, सब कुछ गया. It's just you just write at whatever time you get and you just finish it. So it's a mix of both, Siddharth. There is planned writing, which is I think 80-90%, and then there's unplanned writing, which
Yeah.
happens when you're reading something and a thought kind of hits you at that point of time. So then I just make a note somewhere, either on my mobile, I
Mhm.
mail it to myself, and then the next day when I open my laptop, I add that to the manuscript, and that's basically my writing style. A lot of it also comes from Twitter because now I don't tweet as much as I used to, but the idea of tweeting of writing thoughts is
Mhm.
just all thanks to Twitter. So as much as I might say कि बकवास है, span of attention बर्बाद हो जाता है thanks to Twitter, the fact is that it also it does give you that opportunity to write and
Yeah.
see others writing also. So there is
Right.
social media has a lot of good stuff also,
Right.
provided you spend that much time to find it. So that's the
Absolutely.
answer. There is unplanned and there's planned. Mostly planned. Unplanned is when there's chaos.
Yeah. No, I personally, and it's great that you mentioned Twitter because for me, I think Twitter is one of the best social media website to use out of all of them because I think again this is anecdotal thing that I'd caught once, which really fascinated me as a kid. I think there was a fire at one of the Mahindra and Mahindra offices or a plant or something, a minor, some incident had happened. And Anand Mahindra found out about it before official sources through like one of his employees who was fleeing and like just tweeted and tagged him. And it just, for me, that was one of those, eureka moments where this is one of those fastest means of communication when it can come to anything. So I use
Yeah,
Twitter as literally a news platform. And,
yeah,
like
yeah.
just you have journalists and everyone out there just tweeting, putting out the information, gets you the information as quickly as possible. Well, Anupam, as much as I've enjoyed this chat, we've unfortunately come towards the end of our podcast. It
That's
was
okay.
absolutely lovely having you on. Just before we go, one final question: is there another book in the offing that we can expect from you?
Yes, there is. There is.
Would
I've
you like
already
to tell
started
us
work
about
on the.
it?
I've already started work on the next book. Thankfully, it's not about personal finance because God knows, I don't think मेरे से भी हो पाएगा. But it's about the topic that I just told you, Indian business history. So it's about a certain person. I have just recently signed the contract and I will be starting work soon. So that's another 1 year of my life gone. It's very intense stuff. I had thought that I'll take a break after this book, but no, there is no break at all out here. Yeah. So that's yes, there is a second book. Yes, I've started work on it, and it's about Indian business history. A certain chapter from there.
Speaking as a person who's just finished reading your book, as much as I hate the fact that you'll have to sacrifice a year, I'm really looking forward to reading the book
Thank
because
you. Very
I
kind of you.
genuinely,
Thank you.
genuinely enjoyed perusing your book. It was very easy to read, flew really well off my hands.
Thank you.
Genuinely enjoyed reading it. Thank you, Anupam. Thank you for joining us on this podcast and writing this beautiful book, which I really urge all of my listeners to check out once. Anupam's actually put out a lot of his wisdom on his Twitter feed as well. So if Twitter is your format, you could check it out there. But I would really advise checking out this book and giving it a read. It would give you a really interesting perspective as to how to manage your personal finances, or a very great place to start it off with. Thank you so much, Anupam. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Siddharth. Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, check us out on Instagram, YouTube, and all other social medias with the same name, Kitabi Karwan. We post delightful stuff about books, opinions, reviews, posts, book club meetings, a lot of other things happen on all our social media pages. We would love to hear your feedback on the podcast, or if you have some suggestions to have authors or editors, translators, anyone association with the world of books on our podcast, do pass it on to us. We'd love to have them. Thank you so much for joining in. And as the cliche goes, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.